Autumn 1940. Deep inside a smoky Berlin war room, German generals leaned over vast maps of Europe, their confidence unshakable. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. Britain stood alone, battered and desperate. And the United States? To the men in grey uniforms, America was hardly worth a second thought. They scoffed at reports of American rearmament. A nation of merchants, they said. A land of jazz music, baseball, and Hollywood movies. Not a land of warriors. Not a people forged for mechanized war. At dinner tables in occupied Paris and strategy meetings in the Reich's headquarters, the mocking tone was the same. America was seen as soft, fractured by politics, distracted by consumer comforts. One officer famously dismissed the country outright. The Americans cannot build tanks. They can build refrigerators and cars, but not machines of war. To the German High Command, industrial might was about efficiency, ruthlessness, control. In their eyes, America was too disorganized, too democratic, too chaotic to transform its factories into engines of destruction. They imagined assembly lines bogged down by unions, by lawyers, by committees arguing instead of producing. They believed that even if America entered the war, its industry would sputter and collapse under pressure. These men looked westward across the Atlantic and saw weakness. They laughed at the thought of farmers turning into tank builders, of auto workers forging cannons, of housewives riveting aircraft frames. The Reich's military machine, disciplined, tested, already blooded in campaigns from Warsaw to Paris, seemed unassailable, but their arrogance carried a fatal flaw. They underestimated not only America's resources, but also its character. They mistook debate for disunity, freedom for fragility, diversity for weakness. They didn't understand that beneath the surface of arguments and elections lay a vast, untapped power, the power of a nation that had not yet been challenged on its own soil. In Berlin, the generals chuckled at reports of Detroit's auto plants experimenting with armored vehicles. They joked that American tanks would arrive with chrome bumpers and leather upholstery. To them, it was proof that the United States remained a country of consumers, not soldiers, and yet far across the ocean, something was stirring. Workshops once filled with radios and washing machines began sketching blueprints for bombers. Engineers who had spent careers designing sleek sedans now studied armor plating and treads. Assembly lines designed to roll out shiny cars were being retooled to build machines for a different purpose: survival. In the stillness of those early years, before Pearl Harbor, before America's full entry into the war, a question hung in the air. Could this democratic, consumer-driven nation truly rise to meet the demands of total war? The German officers didn't think so. They laughed, they scoffed, they dismissed the idea entirely, but the laughter would not last, because soon, on the other side of the Atlantic, steel would begin to move. Smoke would billow from factory chimneys night and day. Sparks would fly as welders worked without rest. And tanks, real, heavy, deadly tanks, would roll off American assembly lines. Not one every month, not one every week, but one every hour. A reply was coming. Louder than any speech, stronger than any boast, and far deadlier than the generals could have imagined. Spring 1940. While Europe burned, America slumbered. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Tanks were little more than thin-skinned boxes, closer to tractors than instruments of modern war. Soldiers trained with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones to go around. To the outside world, it seemed almost laughable. How could this nation of salesmen and shopkeepers ever hope to challenge the battle-hardened armies of Europe? In the shadow of the Great Depression, American factories had fallen quiet. Assembly lines that once produced millions of cars now slowed to a crawl. Steel mills in Pittsburgh had scaled back, their furnaces dimmed, their workers idle. Aircraft plants struggled to survive, turning out private planes for hobbyists rather than bombers for battle. The nation's focus was on paychecks, not panzer divisions, and so when German generals mocked America, they were not mocking ghosts. Their words had weight. On paper, America looked incapable of rapid mobilization. Its leaders debated in Congress while dictators seized continents. Its people listened to radio dramas and baseball broadcasts while blitzkrieg tore through Europe. To many, the idea that this distracted republic could outproduce the Reich was absurd, yet appearances can deceive. Beneath the quiet, the groundwork for something astonishing had been laid. Detroit, the heart of the auto industry, had already mastered a unique magic: mass production. No other nation in the world could rival its ability to build machines in staggering numbers, quickly and efficiently. Cars, not tanks, had been the focus, but the principles were the same. A single auto plant could turn out thousands of vehicles a day, each one nearly identical to the last. Precision tooling, interchangeable parts, moving assembly lines, these were American inventions, perfected by men like Henry Ford. And though the factories now idled, the knowledge remained. It was a sleeping giant, its muscles at rest but not atrophied. Pittsburgh, too, held quiet strength. Its steel mills, once roaring with molten fire, could be reignited at a moment's notice. The men who worked those mills had generations of experience shaping the iron backbone of a nation. Bridges, skyscrapers, railroads, all had risen from their labor. To forge tanks, ships, and aircraft was not beyond their reach. It was only a matter of demand, but in 1940, the demand did not yet exist. America debated whether this war was theirs to fight. Isolationist voices argued to stay clear of Europe's madness. Factories remained idle, workers anxious for jobs, industrial capacity untapped. The sleeping giant stirred, but did not yet wake. Still, small signs hinted at what was possible. Companies began bidding on military contracts, experimenting with designs. Automakers quietly studied how to adapt their lines for armored vehicles. Aircraft companies tinkered with bombers that for now sat untested. It was a nation in waiting, like a great engine idling in neutral, capable of speed but not yet unleashed. The German generals didn't see this. They saw the weakness, the debates, the empty barracks, the obsolete tanks. They saw only the sleep, not the strength. And then everything changed, because one event, sudden, devastating, unforgettable, would jolt America to its core. The arsenal of democracy would no longer sleep. A giant would awaken. December 7th, 1941, Oahu, Hawaii. The morning sun rose over Pearl Harbor, glinting off the calm waters. But in an instant, that serenity shattered. Screeching engines, exploding bombs, and roaring artillery announced a violence America had long believed was distant. Battleships sank, hangars burned, sailors fought for survival, and a nation watched in stunned silence. The attack was more than a military strike. It was a psychological earthquake. For decades, isolationist voices had dominated American politics, insisting the oceans could shield the country from the world's conflicts. Now those illusions were gone. The war had arrived at America's doorstep. Democracy itself had been challenged, and the price of inaction had never been clearer. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation the following day. His words carried both solemnity and determination. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not fail. But he did more than promise retaliation. He unveiled a vision. America would become the arsenal of democracy. Every factory, every workshop, every craftsman would be harnessed to an unprecedented industrial effort. Factories that once produced refrigerators, automobiles, and radios pivoted overnight to war. Engineers redesigned assembly lines to churn out tanks instead of sedans, bombers instead of passenger planes. Steel mills roared back to life, furnaces blazing hotter than ever before. The quiet hum of machinery transformed into the thunder of a nation in motion. In Detroit, auto workers traded their wrenches for rivets, their blueprints for armored hulls. Plants that had built shiny cars now produced Sherman tanks at a pace that stunned even military planners. Pittsburgh steel flowed into battleships and artillery shells, the molten iron a lifeblood for a nation newly awakened to war. The transformation was not easy. America had to overcome shortages, retrain laborers, and solve problems that no civilian industry had ever faced. But necessity is a relentless teacher. Overnight, the United States became a laboratory for mass production on a scale the world had never seen. Techniques of efficiency, once used for consumer goods, were applied to machines of war, and the people responded. Men and women across the country accepted longer hours, risked their health in factories, and learned new trades with remarkable speed. Housewives took on clerical work for defense plants. Teenagers joined assembly lines. Communities reorganized themselves around the rhythm of production, not consumption. The nation's character was being reshaped in steel and sweat. Across the Atlantic, German generals could hardly believe the reports reaching them. Factories once considered incapable of producing a single modern tank were now promising dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. America was proving that a nation of consumers could indeed become a nation of machines of war. Yet doubts lingered. Could a country that had once idolized leisure, comfort, and convenience truly sustain such a transformation? Could it match the discipline of nations at war for years, whose armies had been hardened in battle? The world watched, skeptical, as the sleeping giant shifted into motion. The answer would not come in speeches or promises. It would come in steel, fire, and relentless production. But for now, as the smoke of Pearl Harbor still hung over the Pacific, the question hung in the air like a challenge. Could a nation of consumers truly become a nation of tanks, planes, and guns? The answer would soon reveal itself. But first, America had to take its first steps into industrial combat. Summer 1942, Detroit, Michigan. Once the city of gleaming sedans and roaring engines, Detroit had transformed almost overnight into a fortress of steel and determination. The hum of car factories, familiar to every American, now carried a different rhythm, a rhythm of war. The same assembly lines that once produced shiny Packards and Fords now forged Sherman tanks, B-24 bombers, and anti-aircraft guns, each machine a testament to ingenuity and resolve. Ford Motor Company led the charge. Its Willow Run plant became the stuff of legend. Here, a massive facility stretching over a mile of floor space housed the most ambitious industrial experiment the world had ever seen. Engineers and laborers worked side by side in near-constant motion, orchestrating an industrial ballet that defied imagination. Their mission: to build B-24 Liberators, long-range bombers that would carry the fight deep into enemy territory. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, a feat so staggering that German spies struggled to believe the reports. Chrysler and General Motors followed with equal fervor. Chrysler's factories churned out Sherman tanks, armored beasts that would become the backbone of Allied ground forces. Thousands of tons of steel were transformed into mobile fortresses, equipped with guns, radios, and armor designed to endure the fiercest battles. GM, once synonymous with luxury automobiles, produced everything from aircraft engines to jeeps, the small but indispensable workhorses of the battlefield. Every plant that had once catered to consumers now served a single, higher purpose, winning a war that threatened the world's freedom. The scale of this transformation was almost surreal. Engineers solved problems no military had encountered before. How to mass-produce heavy bombers without sacrificing quality. How to streamline tank production while maintaining precision. How to coordinate tens of thousands of workers in synchronized effort. Laborers who had once built kitchen appliances or family cars now mastered riveting, welding, and ballistics. The learning curve was steep, yet America had no choice but to climb it. Across the Atlantic, German generals continued to scoff. At first, they had underestimated the ingenuity of a nation that had once seemed soft, fragmented, and incapable But reports began to filter back from intelligence networks. The Americans were producing not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of machines of war. Every week brought new totals, each more staggering than the last. The generals who had once laughed now leaned forward with unease as numbers and production schedules arrived by telegram and coded message. And it wasn't just quantity, it was quality. Tanks rolled off assembly lines with precision. Planes flew off runways fully armed and tested. America had not only matched European industrial techniques, but had improved upon them, combining innovation with relentless efficiency. The very factories that had once seemed incapable of supporting a military now outpaced even the most disciplined adversaries. In Detroit, the city's spirit mirrored its factories. Workers volunteered for double shifts. Women, often barred from industrial work before the war, became skilled riveters, electricians, and machinists. Entire communities reorganized around production goals, school schedules adjusted to factory needs, and neighborhoods celebrated every completed bomber or tank as a victory in itself. The people, the machines, and the strategy fused into a single unstoppable force. By 1943, it was undeniable. The American industrial miracle was underway. German intelligence reports shifted from ridicule to disbelief, then to worry. What had once seemed a harmless nation of consumers had become a nation capable of overwhelming the most experienced Wehrmacht officers. And as the numbers continued to climb, bomber by bomber, tank by tank, gun by gun, the shadow of doubt began to creep into the minds of men who had once mocked Detroit, because soon the scale of production would reach a point that even the hardened generals of Germany could not ignore. And the numbers began to terrify even hardened Wehrmacht officers. Spring 1943, somewhere in the heart of the Midwest, a steel and concrete factory hummed like a living organism. The smell of hot metal and oil hung in the air, mixing with the sweat of thousands of workers. Here Sherman tanks emerged not slowly, but with a rhythm that seemed impossible, one after another, hour by hour. Each a fully armed and tested war machine ready for the front lines. The U.S. had perfected the industrial miracle of mass production. Unlike the handcrafted panzers of Germany, which took months to assemble, American tanks rolled off assembly lines in astonishing numbers. Each tank came with a full complement of spare parts, meticulously catalogued and shipped to supply depots around the world. Engines, turrets, ammunition crates, every component was synchronized in a vast, intricate dance that kept the war machine moving forward. Chrysler, Detroit, and Toledo plants became temples of efficiency. Conveyor belts stretched endlessly, moving welded hulls, rotating turrets, and massive engines from one station to the next. Workers performed repetitive tasks with unyielding precision. A rivet here, a gear assembly there, a final inspection at the end. And yet it was not mindless labor. Engineers constantly innovated to speed production, reduce costs, and maintain durability. Each hour saw dozens of tanks completed, each hour a small triumph in the war effort. Supply chains, once the hidden backbone of America's industry, now became a lifeline for armies overseas. Steel flowed from Pittsburgh furnaces to Detroit factories. Rubber, engines, and electronics were shipped by rail and convoy to production centers. Workers in Ohio and Indiana coordinated deliveries like clockwork, ensuring that nothing slowed the relentless pace of manufacturing. Even in wartime chaos, the U.S. industrial network ran smoother than many European civilian economies. Across the Atlantic, German generals struggled to comprehend what they were seeing or hearing. Reports from spies, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance described a world they had never imagined, a nation that could produce tanks, not by hand, but by the thousands, in weeks instead of months. The rhythm of American factories was alien to men, accustomed to painstaking artisanal assembly lines. How could a country that once made cars for comfort now manufacture engines of war at this scale? The implications were staggering. Every Sherman tank sent to North Africa, Italy, and later Normandy represented not only brute firepower, but a logistical triumph. It signaled an ability to sustain an army in the field with a supply chain and industrial output unmatched by any other nation. Every hour a tank left the assembly line, the balance of war shifted slightly further in favor of the Allies. Yet, despite the awe-inspiring pace, tanks were only one part of a much larger strategy. Bombers, artillery, ships, rifles, and ammunition moved through parallel networks of production, each feeding into a growing tide of American firepower. The Wehrmacht, experienced though it was, faced a reality it could not easily counter. A nation that had once seemed slow and unprepared had become a storm of steel and movement, relentless and inexhaustible. And even as the Sherman tanks rolled from Detroit to distant battlefields, another truth became clear to the generals who had mocked America. This was only the beginning, because tanks were only one piece of America's tidal wave of steel. The Atlantic Ocean was a battlefield in itself, and beneath its waves, German U-boats prowled with deadly intent. Yet above the waves, America's industrial heart was pumping faster than ever, turning steel, aluminum, and ingenuity into a flood that could not be stopped. Liberty ships, the cargo lifelines of the Allies, rolled off American docks at an unprecedented pace, one every 24 hours. Submarines tried to sink them, but the Americans simply built more, faster than the sea could swallow them. The scale of production was staggering. Aircraft plants produced tens of thousands of planes in a single year: P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses. Every bomber and fighter represented not only superior firepower, but also the coordination of tens of thousands of workers, engineers, and logistics specialists. Meanwhile, artillery factories cranked out billions of shells, ammunition moving from mills to fronts as if guided by an invisible hand. Steel mills ran day and night, pouring molten metal into molds that would become ships, tanks, and guns. Each piece of equipment carried the fingerprints of countless Americans who had adapted their skills from civilian life to war. Housewives became welders, auto mechanics became tank engineers. Teenagers learned to operate cranes and conveyor belts. Every citizen became part of a vast, interlocking machine of production. The contrast with Germany could not have been starker. While German factories produced high-quality tanks, U-boats, and aircraft, they were constrained by materials, labor shortages, and constant Allied bombing. A Panther tank might take months to build. An American Sherman could roll off the line in mere weeks. A U-boat could sink a single ship, but America could launch a Liberty ship every day. Every statistic told the same story. America's industrial rhythm was relentless, overwhelming, and ultimately unstoppable. The numbers were almost unbelievable. By mid-1943, the United States had produced over 24,000 aircraft, more than 30,000 tanks, and hundreds of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and support vehicles. Liberty ships numbered in the thousands, outpacing the combined efforts of the Axis in maritime construction. Artillery shells poured from the presses in the billions, supplying fronts from North Africa to Italy and soon to France. Every day, the balance of resources tipped further toward the Allies, forcing German generals to rethink their strategy in the face of a production machine they could not match. And yet, these were not just numbers, they were instruments of war, each one capable of shaping the battlefield. The human cost of deploying these machines was immense, but so too was the resolve behind them. Every bomber that left an American airfield, every Sherman that rumbled onto a dock in England, carried the weight of a nation's determination, a message that the United States had not only entered the war, it had committed to winning it. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe faced a stark new reality. Battles that had once been decided by strategy, experience, or elite units were now influenced by sheer numbers, relentless supply, and industrial ingenuity. The tidal wave of American steel was arriving, and there was no dam to stop it. And as the shipments began to cross the Atlantic, as convoys navigated mines and submarines, the transformation became tangible. Weapons, tanks, aircraft, and artillery were no longer promises on paper. They were real, arriving in ports, moving across continents, and reshaping battlefields with every shipment. And soon, these weapons began arriving in Europe, reshaping battlefields overnight. November 1942. The deserts of North Africa stretched endlessly, a blistering sun overhead and sand choking the horizon. German generals, seasoned in campaigns across Europe, were confident. Their panzer divisions were sleek, well-tested, deadly. Their tactics had carried them to victories, from Poland to France. Yet as Sherman tanks rumbled across the dunes, the generals felt a creeping unease. These were not isolated vehicles. They were part of a tide, hundreds, then thousands, moving with relentless precision. In Tunisia, the American logistical machine became as deadly as the weapons it produced. Every Sherman tank that fell in battle could be replaced within weeks. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed continuously, ensuring that frontline units remained combat-ready. German commanders, accustomed to staggering their own mechanized forces carefully, began to understand a new reality. Quantity carried its own form of power. The Tigers and Panthers could dominate in one-on-one encounters, but 5 Shermans to every Tiger told a story the generals could no longer ignore. The same pattern appeared in Sicily and Italy. Every hill and valley saw American forces arrive with a flood of armored vehicles, artillery and aircraft. Even when German soldiers fought with skill and determination, the sheer weight of American production forced them to retreat, regroup, or risk encirclement. Experience and discipline mattered less when confronted with overwhelming numbers and endless resupply. By 1944, Normandy presented the ultimate test. On June 6th, the beaches swarmed with Allied soldiers, but behind them lay the machines. Thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft that had crossed the Atlantic, armored and ready. The Wehrmacht, dug in and prepared for a traditional defensive fight, could not account for the scale of this industrial onslaught. Every Sherman, every M4 tank, every LCVP landing craft was a symbol of a nation's capacity to sustain war on a scale Germany could not match. The Americans had turned production into strategy. Factories had become battlefronts, and every shipment was a silent weapon against the Wehrmacht's morale and calculations. German officers, who had once dismissed the United States as incapable of modern warfare, now studied reports of convoys, assembly lines, and shipping statistics with growing dread. They realized that each tank lost did not weaken the Americans. It was replaced, often within days. Each aircraft shot down was part of a stream that seemed endless. This was industrial warfare at a scale the world had never seen, and it forced German generals into an unthinkable position. No maneuver, no strategy, no battlefield heroics could counterbalance the tidal wave of American production. The war was no longer simply about skill or courage. It had become a race against a nation that could produce more than the enemy could ever destroy. Across every theater, from the sands of Africa to the hedgerows of France, German commanders began to understand a terrifying truth. They were facing a foe whose weapons seemed limitless, whose factories never slept, and whose determination had transformed a nation of consumers into a force of unprecedented industrial might. And as the Sherman tanks pressed forward, the artillery roared and the bombers rained down from the sky. The generals confronted a grim reality. For German generals, a dreadful realization set in. The war had become unwinnable. Night had fallen over the industrial heart of Germany. Cities that had once pulsed with the rhythm of machinery were now scarred landscapes of smoke, fire, and ruin. Allied bombers carved paths of destruction across factories in Essen, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley, turning assembly lines into twisted steel and shattered dreams. The German war machine, once feared for its precision and efficiency, faltered under the relentless assault. The Reich had long relied on slave labor to sustain its industries, bringing in tens of thousands of prisoners to operate machinery and haul materials. But the results were pitiful compared to American standards. Efficiency, innovation, and trained engineering, core pillars of production in the United States, could not be replaced by coerced labor. Broken machines, unskilled workers, and constant sabotage slowed output, leaving the Wehrmacht increasingly under-equipped. Raw material shortages compounded the problem. Oil from Romania became intermittent. Steel, copper, and aluminum were diverted to maintain critical military units, often at the expense of the very factories that could have produced more tanks, planes, and weapons. German engineers improvised where they could, but improvisation could not overcome the gap between ambition and reality. Every day, American convoys crossed the Atlantic, arriving with supplies and weapons Germany could not match. Every day, the Allies built more, faster, stronger, and then there was mismanagement. Nazi leaders, obsessed with ideology and micromanaging production quotas, undermined their own industries. Orders from Berlin were often contradictory, impossible to fulfill, and disconnected from the reality of the front lines. Factories were forced to prioritize luxury weapons over practical needs, or to shift production abruptly, wasting both materials and time. Meanwhile, morale among workers plummeted, fatigue and fear eroding productivity in ways no propaganda could mask. In contrast, the United States had perfected coordination, innovation, and incentives. Workers were trained, motivated, and recognized for their contributions. Women in steel mills and aircraft plants received wages and respect. Their labor became a source of national pride rather than coercion. Engineers and managers collaborated across companies to streamline production, solve technical challenges, and push machinery to its limits. Efficiency, not fear, drove the American industrial juggernaut. By mid-1944, the contrast could not have been starker. While German factories lay in ruins or struggled under impossible conditions, American production reached dizzying heights. Sherman tanks, bombers, Liberty ships, and artillery flooded the theaters of war. The industrial scale and reliability of the United States had turned into a strategic weapon, as lethal as any soldier on the battlefield. Across Europe, German generals saw the consequences in real time. Battles that should have been evenly matched were now decided not by tactics alone, but by who could sustain losses and continue fighting. America's relentless supply of men and machines became a force multiplier, making every engagement a test of endurance and resources. The Reich, once a symbol of disciplined military might, faltered under the pressure of an industrial opponent that never slept. And yet, for all the devastation wrought by Allied bombers and the collapse of German logistics, the story of industrial warfare was far from over. America's factories, instead of slowing, only accelerated. New plants were built, lines were extended, production targets were raised, not lowered. Every destroyed German facility was replaced conceptually by 1,000 American machines, each one proof that innovation, coordination, and national determination could outmatch fear, coercion, and destruction. Meanwhile, American factories only accelerated. Winter, 1944. The battlefields of Europe groaned under the weight of war. But the true force shaping the conflict was not always visible to the naked eye. It was the flood of machines arriving relentlessly from the United States that was rewriting the rules of combat. German tanks rolled through the hedgerows of Normandy. B-17 and B-24 bombers dominated the skies. Liberty ships delivered men, fuel, and ammunition faster than Germany could destroy them. Across the Pacific, aircraft carriers, amphibious vehicles, and planes surged forward, overwhelming Japanese defenses. By now, the scale of American production had reached staggering proportions. The United States was churning out more tanks, planes, ships, and artillery than Germany and Japan combined. Every day, entire divisions of machines and men were transported across oceans, mountains, and rivers, poised to strike wherever needed. Factories ran continuously, lines synchronized like clockwork, producing a tide of steel that no army in history had faced. German generals, veterans of blitzkrieg and meticulously planned campaigns, could not ignore the reality. In memoirs written after the war, they admitted the truth. They were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting an industrial superpower. Panzers, no matter how skillfully commanded, were now part of a flood that could absorb losses and replace them with ease. Every strategic decision had to account for America's capacity to produce, ship, and sustain war on a scale that defied imagination. On the front lines, the effects were undeniable. In Europe, Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany, backed by armor and artillery that Germany could not hope to match. In the Pacific, island after island fell as American carriers and amphibious divisions moved forward, each invasion supported by endless supplies of men and machines. Resistance was fierce, but the overwhelming numbers created a momentum that was impossible to stop. Even as Germany attempted counterattacks, they faced a sobering reality. Each tank destroyed, each plane shot down, each U-boat sunk was simply replaced by more, faster, and often better versions. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Wehrmacht, once feared across the continent, found itself continually reacting to a force it could never outproduce, outlast, or outmaneuver. By 1945, the contrast between the warring nations' industrial capacities was undeniable. American factories had become a strategic weapon, as potent as any soldier, general, or tactic. The flood of machines had not just supported the troops, it had defined the war itself. Supply lines, production schedules, and logistical coordination became the invisible hand-directing battles, sieges, and campaigns. And as Hitler's generals watched their forces dwindle, as cities fell and armies surrendered, the truth could no longer be denied. They were not losing merely to combat skill or strategy. They were losing to the relentless tide of American steel and ingenuity. Every Sherman, every bomber, every ship represented the unstoppable momentum of a nation that had mastered the art of industrial war. And in the end, Hitler's Reich collapsed under a tide of machinery. Autumn, 1945. Europe lay scarred and silent, the echoes of gunfire replaced by the hum of rebuilding. Cities once shattered by bombs were now filled with the rhythms of reconstruction. Factories restarted, ships were repaired, and the machines that had carried a nation to victory now laid the foundation for peace. But the lessons of the war lingered, sharp and indelible, in the minds of soldiers, generals, and civilians alike. The war had demonstrated a truth that would reshape strategy for generations. Battlefield brilliance alone could not secure victory. Armies might maneuver with genius, commanders might inspire courage, but without the backbone of industrial might, even the most formidable forces would falter. The Germans, who had once laughed at America's soft factories in 1940, had learned this lesson at the highest cost. Their memoirs and post-war analyses admitted the bitter reality. They were defeated not solely by American troops, but by the ceaseless rhythm of production, by a nation capable of transforming raw materials into tanks, planes, ships, and artillery faster than they could be destroyed. The contrast was stark. German factories, constrained by ideology, mismanagement, and relentless Allied bombing, had faltered. America's industrial engine, in contrast, had roared to life. Detroit, Pittsburgh, and dozens of other cities had become fortresses of production, turning ordinary citizens into participants in a national endeavor of unprecedented scale. The war was a testament to organization, innovation, and the determination of a free society harnessing its collective potential. The legacy of this effort extended beyond victory. For America, industry was no longer just a tool of commerce. It had become a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and global influence. The factories that had built Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers now produced the infrastructure of peace, homes, bridges, automobiles, and the goods that would fuel post-war prosperity. The skills, systems, and culture of production established during the war would define America's economic and technological dominance for decades to come. And yet, the story was not simply one of machines and numbers. It was a story of people, of engineers who reimagined assembly lines, of women who mastered welding and riveting, of teenagers and veterans who adapted to unprecedented demands. It was a story of communities that sacrificed leisure, comfort, and even safety to contribute to a collective effort greater than any single individual. This was the human element behind the steel and concrete, the heartbeat that gave the machinery purpose. The German generals, once so sure of their superiority, had learned the hard way that industrial capacity could outweigh tactical genius. Their laughter, once echoing through Berlin in 1940, had long since turned to disbelief and despair. Victory in modern war was no longer a matter of maneuvering divisions or mastering terrain alone. It was a matter of production, supply, and the ability to outlast the enemy in a contest of resources and resolve. For America, the implications were profound. The war had proven that a nation's strength was measured not just on the battlefield, but in the factories that sustained it. Innovation, efficiency, and determination were weapons as vital as rifles or artillery. The ability to mobilize an entire society for a common purpose became the defining advantage, one that ensured survival, victory, and global influence. And as the last tanks were decommissioned and the final bombers returned to their hangars, one lesson emerged with crystal clarity. In the age of machines, the factory could be mightier than the battlefield. The roar of Detroit, the furnaces of Pittsburgh, and the hum of countless American assembly lines had not just won a war, they had reshaped history, proving that resilience, preparation, and the hidden strength of industry were as decisive as courage, strategy, and sacrifice. The legacy of mass production was written not only in steel and engines, but in the enduring proof that a nation united in purpose could turn the ordinary into the extraordinary and emerge victorious.